I remember that night like it was yesterday. The restaurant lit up, candles on the table, my son smiling simply, and my daughter-in-law with a look that always carried something more, something sharp. It was his birthday, my boy whom I held in my arms, who grew up, who loved, who made mistakes, and got back up. I just wanted to celebrate, that's all. But some people can't stand peace when they're not the center of it. While the waiter was collecting the menus, she crossed her arms and uttered the phrase that split the evening in two, like a knife piercing the table. She said it aloud so the next table could hear, so the whole room could hear. You can't pay for this, right? I mean, you barely manage your bills. I felt my stomach slowly drop, like someone losing their footing for a second. Not because of the money, but because of her choice to hurt me in public. My son stood motionless, and that hurt more than her words. He looked at me like a voiceless boy, trapped between love and weakness. No words, no defense, only silence, and a child's silence sometimes weighs more than a scream. But I took a deep breath. Age teaches us that those who respond in the heat of the moment return fire, but those who respond at the right time ignite the pride of those who tried to burn us. I could have spoken up. I could have said that I was the one paying for the medical appointments, that I was the one who lent her money when they were both in debt, that the car she was driving was a gift for me. I could have laid the truth out on the table, like a card turned over in the final game. But no. The universe likes an audience when the lesson is important. And that night deserved a stage. So I just smiled. A simple, light, almost polite smile. She thought she had won. He thought I swallowed the humiliation. He thought his phrase was the final blow. But I had already made a decision, and silent decisions are the most dangerous for those who believe they are in control. I simply gave the waiter a discreet signal, a signal that would change everything later. As the night wore on, she laughed, spoke loudly, and mocked with little barbs, as if trying to prove something to herself and not to the world. She wanted an audience, but she didn't know that the real show would only begin when my name echoed through the hall. I didn't need to rush. I didn't need to defend myself. Life had already prepared the ending. I was just waiting for the right moment. And the moment was approaching. The first crack in her confidence didn't come from my words. It came from something Bame made simples. The menu. She kept pointing at the most expensive dishes, like she was in some kind of silent competition that only Ella and Tendia. Lobster, steak, fancy wine, every choice della vinha acompanhada da olher namen Hederico, como esse deses. Let's see if you can handle this, old lady. I was just watching. One thing age gives us is this ability to watch someone dig their own hole thinking they're climbing a ladder. The waiter approached politely, with that practiced smile of someone who sees everything every day. He took our orders. My son, shy as always, ordered something simple. I chose a modest dish and a small glass of wine. But she made a point of exaggerating, of showing that she was enjoying her dinner. And while ordering, she let slip aloud. It's not every day someone else pays, right? Some people at the next table looked. The waiter did too. I saw his expression change for a second. He understood. People who deal with the public can sense humiliation in the air. That's where I made my first move. Without fanfare, without a speech. When the waiter leaned over to ask if everything was all right with the orders, I looked him straight in the eye and whispered, "Excuse me, can I talk to the manager, please? It's about the bill and the reservation." He nodded immediately, respectfully. It wasn't the first time I'd been to that restaurant. It wasn't the first time I'd reserved that room for someone special. But that night, the only person who thought they knew everything was precisely the one who knew nothing. While we waited, she kept talking, filling the air with little jokes. "Don't worry, honey," she said to my son, touching his arm. "If your mom can't pay, we'll just split it with the girls later." She said it loudly, laughing, pointing with her chin at her friends at the other end of the table. I felt his face burn with shame, as if her words were rubbing in his face the false idea that I was a burden. He didn't defend me, but I realized he was uncomfortable too. He was trapped. The manager came to the table a few minutes later. He didn't look at her. He didn't look at my son. He came straight to me. Good evening, ma'am, he said, tilting his head slightly. Would you like to confirm the details of the reservation now? I saw what happened to her face in that instant. It was almost imperceptible, but I noticed. Her eyebrow rose, her mouth tightened. The fork she was holding hung in the air for a second. That was the first crack in the castle of ego she had built around me. Calmly, as if I had nothing to prove, I replied, "Yes. Just make sure everything is under my name, as usual. And when it's time, I'd like you to make the announcement exactly like we agreed, all right?" He smiled, professionally, almost knowingly. "Absolutely, Mrs. Thompson. We'll do it exactly as requested." I saw the confusion in her eyes, mixed with a small but growing dose of fear. What did she mean by as usual? What did she mean by as requested? Since when had I arranged something with the manager that she didn't know about? She tried to regain control through arrogance. "What announcement?" she asked, laughing nervously. "Are we singing Happy Birthday or something?" I simply looked at her with the serenity of someone who has seen a lot in life. "You'll see," I said. "Just enjoy the dinner." She laughed again, but this time the laughter came out somewhat broken, like a cracked glass that still holds water, but any impact could shatter it. While the food was arriving, I did something else that broke her rhythm. I started treating everyone naturally, telling old stories about my son, remembering past birthdays, talking about times when there was no money at all, but plenty of love and respect. There was something in my tone that she couldn't erase. I was planting a contrast. On one side, the recent arrogance. On the other, all the memories that gave me the right to be at that table, regardless of how much money I had in my account. And, without her realizing it, the entire restaurant began to lean emotionally toward me. The waiter already knew. The manager knew. A few curious glances knew that something was brewing. Only those who still believed they had complete control of the situation. She was precisely the one who was about to be exposed by the very echo of her own words. And the night hadn't even truly begun yet. The food arrived hot, beautiful, and fragrant, the kind of dish that makes the entire dining room seem quieter for a few seconds. The smell of melted butter on her lobster was almost theatrical. It seemed a perfect symbol of what was to come, brilliance on the surface, fragility inside. She raised her fork with the satisfaction of someone who believes they've already won. And for a few minutes, dinner continued as if nothing had happened. But it was the silence before the storm. While she ate, she spoke loudly, laughed even more, now not because she was comfortable, but to demonstrate comfort. I heard an effort in every laugh. Disguised insecurity always sounds exaggerated. My son tried to keep the atmosphere light, but I could see the embarrassment in his eyes. He knew she had gone too far. He knew it was unnecessary. But something held him back. The fear of conflict, perhaps. Or the belief that love is synonymous with submission. Poor little boy, he would still learn that love without limits becomes a prison. She nibbled at the lobster and, between sips of wine, subtly offered comments. "This place is expensive, right? I guess we'll see how far the birthday spirit goes." Each word was an arrow pointed at me, but they all fell to the ground. Because the truth is simple. When you already know the outcome, the provocation becomes just a distant sound. I could only watch her dig her own grave. One mistake after another, too confident to notice that the waiter and the manager were exchanging glances. I drank my wine slowly, like someone waiting for a clock to strike midnight, and the clock was ticking away. That's when she started talking about status. She said she didn't want her son, my grandson, to grow up thinking that money didn't matter, that people who were too simple wouldn't go far. The word simple came out of her mouth as an insult, not as a virtue. And I felt the whole room breathe differently. Simplicity, in that environment, wasn't something ugly. It was something rare. And, ironically, it was she, with her exaggerated gestures, who seemed out of place. The manager returned to the table. Not looking at her. Not looking at my son, just for me. And he asked for permission with an elegance that cut through the air like a razor. "Mrs. Thompson, shall we prepare the announcement now?" My heart stopped beating so fast, it calmed down, because that was the moment. Her hand froze in midair. A piece of lobster fell onto the plate, His eyes widened for a second. A brief but profound moment. The mask began to crack. She tried to laugh again, but the sound came out weak. Perhaps, for the first time that night, she felt feared. I'm not afraid of myself, fear of being wrong. And I replied with the calm of someone who has already won, even before the audience applauded. Yes, it's time. When the manager left, the atmosphere changed. The table became quieter. People began to realize that something was about to happen. And she finally realized she didn't know who she was messing with. The manager walked to the main counter of the restaurant. He wasn't in a hurry, the kind of calculated step of someone who knows all eyes will soon be on him. Meanwhile, my daughter-in-law tried to regain her composure. She straightened her shoulders, wiped her lips with her napkin, and raised her chin. Pride is a wild instinct. Even wounded, it still tries to appear bigger than it is. My son looked at me, confused. Doubt flickered in his eyes, like someone trying to put together a puzzle with missing pieces. "Mom, what's going on?" he asked in a low voice. I touched his hand lightly. Not to answer, but to say, "Confides, there are things a mother can't explain with words. She reveals them through experiences." And then it happened. The dining room suddenly grew quieter, as if someone had turned down the volume of life. The manager picked up the microphone. The restaurant lights reflected off the metal, making it gleam, exactly as I wanted. He cleared his throat elegantly and said, in a voice firm enough to reach every table, every ear, every breath, "Ladies and gentlemen, we would like to thank everyone for being here tonight. We have a very special reservation to celebrate." My daughter-in-law stopped chewing. Her eyes were fixed on the manager, as if trying to anticipate his next sentence, like someone in a movie about to discover that the villain was the last person she expected. The break came, and then after that, the coup. Loudspeaker, "Tonight, we have the pleasure of celebrating the birthday of Mr. Michael Thompson, an event fully hosted and sponsored by Mrs. Eleanor Thompson." My name came out clean, crystal clear, vibrant. Mrs. Eleanor Thompson. It echoed through the hall like a church bell announcing truths. There was applause. People who didn't even know me smiled. The waiter nodded. The sound of recognition traveled through the air and fell directly on her ego, like a bucket of cold water on an arrogant fire. Her trembling hand gripped the fork. She tried to smile, but her face wouldn't obey. It was like watching a tower collapse in slow motion. And then came the second part of the announcement, the one I personally requested. The dinner, drinks, and the birthday cake are completely covered in advance. No one here needs to worry about the bill tonight. Mrs. Thompson insisted on taking care of every detail. There was more applause, not to humiliate, but to admire. And what is more painful to pride than seeing someone you tried to belittle being celebrated? She looked around desperately, searching people's faces for any sign of support, but she saw only respect for me, and doubt about her. My son, silent, had tears in his eyes, not because of the food, not because of the advertisement, but because he realized something that I had waited years for him to see. I was never a burden. I've always been the foundation. My daughter-in-law lowered her gaze for the first time that night. The tide was turning, and there was no way for her to return to the beach from where she came. Because when the truth is spoken aloud, no one can pretend they didn't hear. When the announcement ended, the restaurant returned to its normal pace, but nothing was truly the same. It was as if the air had changed density. Her laughter subsided, her voice lowered, her shoulders slumped. And yet, proud people rarely accept defeat without trying to get back up, even when there is no ground beneath their feet. She took a deep breath, lifted her face, and forced a tense smile, a last attempt to hold onto the throne he believed he possessed. "Oh, that's nice," she said, with a calmness that sounded too rehearsed. "I just didn't know you could afford something like this." The phrase came out smoothly, but it carried the same intention as the initial one, a disguised attack, an arrow painted pink to look delicate. And that's where arrogant people go wrong. They don't realize that, after the truth is revealed, the insult sounds small, almost childish. The manager was still nearby and heard. The waiter too. Other tables as well. But I wasn't shaken. Because when someone tries to hurt you after losing, it's not revenge, it's desperation. I smiled with the serenity of a lifetime of observing people like that. I gently touched my napkin to my lips, glanced at the live band playing jazz in the background, and only then replied, "You don't need to know what I can afford, darling. Just what I choose to." She swallowed hard. Her gaze began to waver, like a candle about to go out. But it was my son who pulled off the coup she never expected. He followed my example. He took a deep breath, and, in a calm but firm voice, he said, "Mom has always been there for us. Maybe you should start noticing instead of assuming." There was no shouting. There was no fight. Just true, said by someone she thought would remain silent forever. Her expression changed. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was fear. Fear of losing the control she thought she had over him. Fear of realizing that, for the first time, he wasn't by her side. So, she tried the last resort of wounded pride. To become a victim. She placed her hand on her chest, her eyes glistening with almost forced tears, and said loudly, for all to hear, "I was just trying to help. I thought maybe she was struggling." But now nobody believed it. Not after what everyone saw. Not after the announcement made loudly. The mask was torn, and it was too late to glue it back together. I simply watched her, without haste, knowing that this night would not end there. The public humiliation had begun, but the real impact would come later, when the mask of false kindness could no longer sustain the charade. That dinner would be more than just a memory. It would be a turning point. And she still had no idea what was about to happen when the cake arrived. When the cake entered the hall, it looked like a scene from a movie. Lights dimmed, the band changed to a soft melody, and all eyes turned to the table. It wasn't just a cake. It was an event. The kind of moment that makes strangers smile at each other and feel like they're part of something bigger. The waiter pushed the cart slowly, with almost artistic care, and behind him came 2 lit golden candles. It was impossible not to look. My daughter-in-law tried. She glanced at her cell phone, fiddled with her napkin, feigned interest in her glass of wine. All to no avail. The attention of the room was magnetized there, where she had no control whatsoever. And then the chorus began. "Happy birthday to you." The voices rose, clear and harmonious. My son smiled, but not a shy smile. A proud smile. He was no longer ashamed. Shame had changed owners. The moment the cake arrived at the table, the waiter made a point of looking at me first. Not at her. Not at anyone else. "Mrs. Thompson, would you like to make a toast?" My daughter-in-law became rigid. If before she believed that the night revolved around her own confidence, at that moment she realized that the center of the universe had changed address. I stood up slowly, with the calm of someone who knows that every second counts. Getting up was not just a physical act. It was a symbolic gesture. I was rising above the poison, above the humiliation, above the doubt. I raised my glass and said, "To my son, a good man, humble, loyal, and always himself." My son lowered his eyes, overcome with emotion, but that was only the beginning. And to this new year of his life, I continued, my voice firm and clear, may he never let anyone convince him that kindness means weakness. A profound silence fell over the table, unpleasant for some, liberating for others. My daughter-in-law felt the blow, not a direct attack, but a reflex. She was exactly what my sentence described, someone who confused kindness with submissiveness, love with obligation. She smiled slightly, trying to feign indifference. But her hands were trembling. The fork tapped involuntarily on the plate, a nervous rhythm, small but impossible to ignore. And then, something even more powerful happened. My son got up too. He looked up, took a deep breath, and finished the speech I had begun. To my mother, who always gave even when she had little. Who never needed to prove her worth, because it speaks for itself. The entire table applauded, some people, strangers too. And at that moment, she was no longer the woman in control. It was the woman in the shadow, the person who tried to humiliate and ended up witnessing their own downfall. But the most remarkable thing wasn't the cake. It was the look. A single glance from my son to her, not out of hatred, but out of clarity, out of decision. It was as if that night had awakened something inside him that had lain dormant for years. And she realized it. For the first time, she was losing not the argument but the power. And those who lose power try to regain it, no matter the cost. She was still going to do something that no one at that table expected. When the cake was served, the evening seemed to have found a balance. Light laughter, conversations resumed. The atmosphere was no longer sharp, it was comfortable. But wounded pride doesn't accept peace. Wounded pride bleeds, and when it bleeds, it bites. I saw in her eyes that the inner silence was screaming, begging for revenge, pleading for one last blow, because losing without trying again would be unbearable for someone who lives for the validation of others. And then she did what desperate people do. He tried to destroy what he could not control. She placed her fork on the plate too forcefully and stood up with a glass in her hand. He smiled, but it was a smile that trembled at the edges, like glass about to shatter. I would like to say something too. The table fell silent. The guests looked. My son took a deep breath, anticipating the storm, and I, calmly, just observed, because those who have already won do not fear the final act. She raised her glass, but not to make a toast. To accuse. It's sweet that this dinner is paid for, she said, her voice loud, aimed for the whole room to hear. But maybe we shouldn't celebrate so loudly when someone uses their savings like this. A jolt ran across the table. It murmured like electricity. She tried to portray my generosity as a sacrifice. He tried to reduce me from a matriarch to someone who spent what little she had just to get attention. A low blow. Dirty. Predictable. Her strategy was clear. To turn the public against me. If he couldn't win through brilliance, he would try to win through doubt. But what she didn't know, the thing is, I've never played with improvisation, but I had prepared more than just dinner. I had proof. Evidence that silenced any narrative. I slid my bag onto my lap and slowly unzipped it, creating deliberate tension, as if the room itself were holding its breath. I took out a thick envelope with a gold seal. I didn't say anything yet. I just placed it on the table, in full view of everyone. Her breath caught in her throat. His gaze tried not to wander, and failed, too. My son, confused, asked, "Mom, what is that?" I responded with the calmness of someone who has learned to win without shouting. "Something I was going to give you later. But maybe now is the right moment." She swallowed hard. Too late to turn back. Too late to undo what I said. I slid the envelope over to my son. He opened it. Silence. Then, eyes wide open, trembling hands, mouth slightly open. Because there was no debt inside. There was no such thing as little money. There was no fragility. There were corporate documents, investment contract, the transfer of part of my company. I was making my son the majority shareholder. Not tomorrow, not one day, there. At that dinner. And the only person who didn't know, he was precisely the one who thought he knew everything. My son, in shock, stood up again, more determined than before. "Mom, you own this much?" I held his hand with pride. For years. The daughter-in-law was devastated. His face turned pale. The eyes sought refuge where there was no way out. The public humiliation she tried to orchestrate for me, it swelled, became a tide, and returned entirely to her. When my son finished reading everything, the restaurant didn't need to applaud. The silence was applause enough. My daughter-in-law, who had previously filled the air with artificial laughter and sharp remarks, could now barely breathe properly. The pride that sustained her slipped like sand through her fingers. She looked at the documents as one stares at a broken mirror, without understanding which part of her own image was lost first. She tried to speak, but no sound came out. He tried to smile, but his face wouldn't obey, and then he sat down slowly, as if accepting, even unwillingly, that the throne had become an ordinary chair. My son, with tears in his eyes, turned to me with a tenderness I hadn't seen in years, a tenderness that needed no words, but he said it anyway, perhaps because love, when it awakens, needs to be audible. "I'm proud of you, Mom." There were 4 words, but to her it felt like an earthquake. Because everything she feared was there. My son looked at me with admiration, not at her. He saw value, where she tried to see weakness. And then something happened that I never imagined I would see from that woman. She touched his arm, her voice low, almost childlike. Honey, I didn't know. I was just worried. But he interrupted, not rudely, maturely.
No.
You assumed. And you were cruel about it. There was no anger. There was a limit, something she never thought he would set. That's where she broke down. Her eyes filled with real tears this time, not faked ones, not out of regret, but out of fear. Fear of losing the man she thought she controlled. Fear of being seen exactly as I was, a woman who uses her ego to hide her insecurity. She then turned to me, for the first time, without a smile, without irony. Mrs. Thompson, the voice failed. He breathed. He tried again. I'm sorry. It was weak. It was too late. And everyone knew, including her. He apologized not because he understood the pain he caused, but because he realized the position he was in alone. I watched her, not with revenge, clearly, because at that moment I understood something bigger. Shame destroys the ego, but it doesn't heal character. Forgiveness without transformation is just makeup over a wound. And I wouldn't respond impulsively, I would wait for the truth to emerge, because it would. It always appears when pride is on its knees. And the proof of that would come when dinner was over. Because the lights in the hall dim the theater, but inside the home, nobody performs for very long. And that night, far from the tables, applause, and jazz, I would hear the phrase that would dismantle everything she pretended to be. We left the restaurant 2 hours later. The atmosphere was different, the kind of silence that doesn't weigh you down, it just allows you to think. My son walked beside me peacefully, like someone who had finally breathed his own air. I sensed a maturity in him that I hadn't seen since he got married. As if something inside him had awakened after years of sleeping under the shadow of her emotional control. My daughter-in-law followed behind, short steps, her purse pressed against her body. Not for style, out of insecurity. Her heels echoed on the parking lot floor as if marking the countdown of a crumbling empire. When we got close to the cars, she called out, Michael, can we talk? My son looked at me before answering. He didn't ask for permission. He asked to be present, as if to say, without words, don't leave me alone with this. We stopped. She took a deep breath, her eyes shining more with frustration than genuine regret. I just feel like I wasn't included tonight. My son raised an eyebrow, something that rarely happened to him. You were included. You just wanted control. The sentence was short, but it pierced through. She bit her lip, took 2 steps forward, and let out what she had been holding back since dinner. I thought if I made her look small, I'd look bigger. And there, without an audience, without lights, without music, the mask has fallen, completely. She confessed, her voice breaking. I was jealous of how much he respects you. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about dinner. It was about a dispute. Silent, petty, emotional. She wanted a place in his heart, and he thought he needed to shrink mine to make it fit. My son exhaled, as if expelling years of pent-up tension. You don't become bigger by shrinking someone else. She cried. Not gracefully, not in control, and for the first time I saw, not the woman who attacked me, but the wounded child inside her. I didn't apologize, I did not retaliate with poison. I simply said what needed to be said, not by shouting. In truth, respect is earned, not won through humiliation. She lowered her head, because there was no defense against it, there was no argument that could be made where responsibility finally settled. And while she was crying, what surprised me most wasn't her pain. It was the relief on my son's face. He was free, not of marriage, but of silence. In that dark parking lot, he saw clearly. I was never a rival, I've always been down to earth. Natasha, my daughter-in-law, only realized this too late, but we would still have a bigger conversation, away from fear, away from the theater, away from the applause. A conversation that would define the future of our family. The following days passed like a cold winter wind, not freezing cold, but enough to remind us that something had changed forever. Dinner was behind us, but its impact remained within each of us, like a bell that continues to ring even after the last chime. My son visited me twice that week. Not to talk about the money or the paperwork, but to spend time with me. The simple things. The real things. A coffee, conversation, laughter. He was different. More present. More aware. As if he were returning to his own center after years orbiting the emotional life of another person. And it was on one of those mornings while I was making tea that the doorbell rang. I knew who it was even before opening it. My daughter-in-law, Natalia, was at my gate, eyes swollen, makeup smeared, posture slumped. No heels, no expensive perfume, no pose. Just her, raw, vulnerable. When I opened the gate, she took a deep breath, as if swallowing her own pride along with the air. "Can I come in?" The question wasn't about entering the house. It was about entering the emotional space she had destroyed trying to force her way in. I watched her for a few seconds that seemed far too long for her. And then I opened the door. He sat down at the table but didn't touch the tea I served. Hands intertwined, knees restless, throat tight. Until finally he released what seemed to burn inside. "I want to do better, but I don't know how." It wasn't an apology, it was a request for guidance, and requests like that only appear when the ego falls and the heart takes over. I took a deep breath. I had two choices at that moment. Heavy checkmark to avenge the pain. Heavy checkmark turning pain into a bridge. No scar heals with salt. So I chose the bridge, but not without conditions. Respect is the first step. I spoke calmly, firmly, and truthfully. Not performance. Not show. Respect. She nodded, tears streaming down her face without resistance. "I know, and I'm asking if you can let me try again." My response wasn't immediate, because forgiveness isn't an unlocked door, it's a door that's opened with discernment. Granting another chance without limits is handing the weapon back to the aggressor, and I wouldn't do that. So I spoke slowly, so that each word would sink in as a foundation, not as noise. "You may try again, but trust is earned in small bricks, not rebuilt in one speech." She cried more, not out of despair, but out of understanding, and true understanding is the first brick. But the real test would come later, that a call for change is worthless without action, and, a few weeks later, the proof appeared. Not at an expensive dinner, not in a public announcement, but in the place where character is revealed, in everyday life. Based on how she would treat my SON, and the way he would talk to me when no one was watching, the ability to recognize one's own reflection without a social mirror. And that test would not be easy, that IT would be definitive. Because life always asks, have you changed, or do you just regret getting caught? And her answer would finally come on the day she needed me. 3 weeks passed, and fate, which is in no hurry but never fails, placed Natalia before the greatest test, one that words could not replace. My son didn't know what was coming. Neither did I. But life always puts the pieces in place at the exact moment when the truth needs to come out. It was late at night when my phone rang, rain beating against the window, wind scratching the roof tiles, that kind of silence that only exists before important news. I answered without imagining it would be her. "Mrs. Thompson, I need help." There was no arrogance, there was no sweet manipulation, there was fragility, raw, stripped bare. Her voice trembled as if she had finally felt the weight of her choices. She explained slowly, as if still ashamed to speak. The car she was using, the one I gave her as a gift, broke down on the road. My son was traveling for work and wasn't answering. The insurance company would take hours to process. And in the rain, in the dark, cold and scared, the only one she thought to call it was me. I could have said no, that I could have remembered every word she said, but this was not a rematch. IT was a laboratory of character. I grabbed my coat and keys and left. When I arrived, she was leaning against the car, huddled up, her arms wrapped around her body like a shield. My car's headlights illuminated her face, and in the reflection of her eyes, there was no arrogance. There was humanity. "You came," she said, almost in a whisper. "Yes." I answered without grandeur, without glory. Help doesn't ask for permission when it's needed. She cried silently, not in my victory, but in her defeat. Because there, in the rain, She saw what she had never seen in the restaurant. I was not a threat, that I wasn't competing, that I was support. I always have been. And there, on that wet shoulder of the road, with the engine stopped and the world reduced to two figures under an umbrella, she confessed what shattered the last layer of her pride. I wanted to be the most important woman in his life. I didn't know there was space for two. And what I replied was not a speech, it was a simple truth, one she never understood until that day. There's room for every woman who comes with love, not rivalry. She closed her eyes, he took a deep breath, and the pride exhaled from his chest like hot smoke that finally meets the cold. The change didn't happen at that instant. Transformation is not a switch, it's construction. But in that dark kilometer, she took the first real step. Not because he apologized, but because he recognized the place he tried to occupy by destroying another. And from then on, everything changed. Slowly, cautious. But it changed. The relationship didn't turn into a miracle, but it stopped being war. And, like any process that truly matures, the next chapter was even bigger. Because life decided there would be no lukewarm peace, there would be a definitive choice. After that rainy night, something began to stir within our family, slow but steady, like roots finally finding fertile ground after years of hitting rock. Natalia didn't become a saint. She didn't transform overnight. But she began to listen more than she spoke, to observe before reacting. Small changes, but genuine ones. And my son noticed. He started coming home earlier, turning off your cell phone at dinner time, looking at her without fear, but with clarity, and clarity frightens those who have never known how to love without controlling. It was on a Saturday afternoon, while we were having coffee in the backyard, that he said something I never expected to hear with such conviction. I'm done being a boy, Mom. I want to be a man. The cup stopped just inches from my mouth, not because of the surprise, but because of the weight of the phrase. Being a man isn't about physical strength, work, or money. It's about inner posture, about taking charge of one's own life. And he took over. From that day forward, he began to set boundaries, not by yelling, not by fighting, but with the calmness of someone who finally knows their own worth. When she criticized him, he didn't back down. When she was being sarcastic, he didn't justify it. When she tried to manipulate him, he would simply say, "No, short." Simple. Non-negotiable. And that's when Natalia really started to change, not out of a desire to please, but because she realized there was no longer room for emotional games. My son was no longer an extension of her. He was an individual, and individuals demand respect. Then the decisive day arrived. Dinner at home. Table set, candles lit, not as a theatrical display, but as a symbol of calm. Natalia sat down in front of me, took a deep breath, and said in a firm voice, "I want us to build a family, not a battlefield." My son held her hand, not as someone submissive, but as someone who chooses to be there, and that's the difference that ends wars. He turned to me and spoke with the same conviction as in that parking lot. "I love her, but I won't allow disrespect again. Not to you. Not to me." And at that moment I understood what so many mothers wait decades to see. My son chose to grow up. He didn't choose to defend me. He didn't choose to stay on my side. He chose himself with honor. And when a man becomes whole, no one needs to lose for the other to win. But one chapter was still missing, the one that would determine whether Natalia had truly understood the lesson or had merely adapted to the fear of losing. Because true love is not born of guilt, it is born from change. And fate still had one last test in store, one that would reveal what lay within when no one else was watching. Some people say that true change can only be measured when no one is watching. And I believe that. Because anyone can apologize in front of witnesses. Anyone can promise change when they fear losing. But only those who transform their hearts act differently when there is no audience, when there is no applause waiting, nor punishment announced. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning. I was watering the plants in the backyard when I heard the gate knock. It wasn't an urgent or anxious knock. It was soft, calm, almost shy. When I opened it, there was Natalia. No makeup, no defensive posture, no cell phone in her hand as a shield. Only her, with a small box and an envelope in the other hand. She entered silently, asked to sit on the sofa, and for a few seconds simply breathed, as if needing to gather courage to cross a difficult inner territory. The silence wasn't uncomfortable this time.
It was respect.
Then she said something that no speech, apology, or terror could have the same power to convey. I sold my car. My gaze searched for answers before I spoke. Why would I sell the car that I myself had given as a gift? Regret? Wounded pride? No. The reason was bigger and deeper. She placed the envelope on the table. Inside was the receipt, the total amount deposited into a joint account with my son. Not hers, and their own. We'll start saving properly. Not for status. For family. I listened to every word as one hears bells ringing, not to church, but to conscience. She didn't ask for forgiveness at that moment. She didn't kneel. She didn't feign remorse. She did something greater. She renounced the symbol that fed her own ego. She dismantled the pedestal with her own hands. His gaze was steady, yet vulnerable. I don't want to compete with you anymore. I want to learn from you. That sentence wasn't meant to be prettied, it was meant to be real. And it was. Because humility isn't about saying sorry. Humility is creating inner space to see others without losing yourself. My son arrived half an hour later. He didn't know anything. When he saw the envelope and heard her decision, he took a deep breath, moved, not by the sale itself, but by its significance. And in that silence, which was worth more than 1,000 encounters, I felt that home, which had once been a battlefield, was now planting seeds of peace. Not perfect, not eternal, but possible. They didn't hug like a couple in a commercial. There was no cinematic scene. There was something better. Respect is born, without any theatrical effort. But the deepest stories never end in reconciliation. They continue, they grow, and they test it. Because every relationship needs to face the ultimate test. Not the public one, but the intimate one, the invisible one. And the biggest one was yet to come. Life has a curious way of evaluating us. When we say we've changed, she observes. When we promise to be better, she tests us. And just when we think we've learned everything, she puts us face to face with the ultimate test. This test arrived on a rainy Friday. MY's son was exhausted from work. Natalia arrived home late, hungry and annoyed by the traffic. It was one of those days when any spark can turn into a wildfire. And the spark came. The dinner burned, the pan crackled, the smoke rose, and my son, tired, blurted out a thoughtless comment, common, human, but harsh at the wrong time. You should have paid more attention. It was enough to rekindle the old ghost, the one that slept, but never completely disappeared. Natalia stopped. He turned slowly, and I saw, even without being there, the exact moment when two versions of her met. Round Pushpin, the old-fashioned woman, proud, reactive, defensive. Round Pushpin, the new woman, conscious, responsible, and under construction. It could have exploded. He could have returned the attack with twice the force that I could have said the phrase that would have destroyed weeks of progress. And your mom would have done it better, right? It was on the tip of my tongue. But instead, she breathed. 1 second.
2. 3.
And he chose differently. I'm tired too, Michael. Let's eat something simple instead. Simple, and poisoned, and provocation. It was the first time she had overcome herself. Not to me, not to him, impulsivity itself. My son noticed immediately. He remained silent for a moment that seemed to hold years of history. Then he approached, placed his hand on her shoulder, and said what a man only says when he truly respects her. Thank you for not turning this into a fight. She smiled, a small, discreet, genuine smile, and that night they ate bread with eggs and drank cheap tea for dinner. But the table was richer than any restaurant could have been. Because it wasn't about food, it was about maturity. And while they laughed, this time together, I understood what most mothers-in-law never realize. I didn't lose my son, I gained a more aware family. Not because she changed for me, but because she changed on her own. And with that, the story moved towards a new chapter. Not a conflict, but a legacy. Because time exacts its due for what we teach, and it rewards what we cultivate. And there was one last revelation. the deepest one, the most transformative. One that wouldn't just change her, but generations. The years passed, not swiftly like the wind, but steadily like a river. Small dinners, long conversations, shy laughs that became frequent. IT wasn't a miracle, it was cultivation. Nothing grows overnight, but if watered every day, it flourishes. Natalia learned to listen, and then to speak in a way that built up, not tore down. My son has forgotten how to be quiet, and has discovered the power of setting boundaries without losing love. And I, who previously thought I needed to win, discovered that the true triumph was seeing them both win together. It was on a spring afternoon, amidst the smell of cake and the sound of birds, that the legacy sealed its own name. Natalia called me over with a smile that wasn't asking for approval. It was offering honesty. "We're pregnant." The word echoed in my chest like a bell announcing something sacred. Not just a grandchild, a chance, a new life, one that would inherit not war, but peace. She held my hand, not weakly, firmly, and he said the phrase that brought an end to the cycle that began in that restaurant. "I want our child to learn respect the way you taught us." Nobody applauded, nobody filmed IT'd, and one needed to testify. Because some victories aren't shown, they're felt. There, in that backyard where so many silences turned into dialogues, Natalia, the same one who once tried to diminish, was now asking to add. And it was there that I understood life in its most mature form. Pushpin humiliation that seeks to destroy never brings any return. Pushpin the firmness that comes from respect changes behaviors, not just moments. Pushpin pain, when used wisely, becomes a bridge, never a wall. I could have won that dinner party that night with just pride, but by choosing patience, truth, and boundaries, I didn't win the argument, I gained a family. And today, as I hold my grandson in my lap, so small and so full of future, I know that every tear, every silence, every chapter, it was worth it. Because it's not about who won the dinner, it's about someone who has overcome themselves. And there, in the quiet house, with hot tea and light laughter, I silently thanked God for not retaliating with fire when they threw a spark at me. The spark would have burned homes. My calmness ignited an inheritance. That was my victory. And this story, which began with pride and ended with life, it's not about a daughter-in-law versus a mother-in-law. It's about the power to transform pain into legacy and family in the future.
End.